Before we begin today's deep dive into the shadows of the Cold War, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. These stories of espionage and historical secrets are only possible with your support, so thank you for listening. The year was 1974. Rome was not just a city of ruins and romance, it was a city on fire. Historians would later call this period the Years of Lead, Anni di Piombo. It was a time when the streets of the Italian capital were paralyzed by strikes, political riots, and the violent tug-of-war between the far right and the communist far left. But beneath the visible chaos of Molotov cocktails and student protests, a much quieter, colder war was being fought in the marble corridors of power. Italy was the geopolitical fault line of the Mediterranean. It had the largest communist party in Western Europe, the PCI, which terrified Washington and delighted Moscow. The CIA station in Rome, housed within the fortress-like Palazzo Margherita on the Via Veneto, was operating at maximum capacity. Their mandate was clear: prevent Italy from tilting east. But in the winter of 1974, the station chief received a cable from Langley that turned their gaze away from the Italian parliament and toward something far more innocuous: the hospitality industry. The cable was designated Flash Priority. It detailed a catastrophic leak of NATO naval maneuvers in the Tyrrhenian Sea. These were not low-level logistical schedules. These were top-secret deployment maps for the U.S. 6th Fleet. Counterintelligence at Langley had traced the hemorrhage of information not to a military base or a government ministry, but to a specific geographical cluster in the heart of Rome. The intelligence had been discussed by visiting American dignitaries and NATO admirals who had all stayed at the same location. They had all stayed at the Palazzo Vernazza. The Vernazza was one of Rome's jewels, a five-star hotel located just a stone's throw from the Villa Borghese. It was a place of old-world opulence: crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, and a guest list that read like a who's who of global diplomacy. It was the preferred residence for traveling senators, diplomats, and military brass who wanted to enjoy the La Dolce Vita lifestyle while conducting the grim business of the Cold War. To the casual observer, the hotel was a sanctuary of neutrality. To the KGB, it was a hunting ground. The CIA realized that the Soviets didn't just have a listening post nearby, they were inside. Someone within the hotel staff, a maid, a porter, a concierge, or a manager, was listening. Enter Marcus Thorn. Thorn was 45, a case officer who had cut his teeth in Berlin and Vienna. He was a man who looked like he was perpetually waiting for a train that had already left. He wore off-the-rack suits that fit poorly, smoked unfiltered cigarettes, and possessed a mind that worked like a forensic accountant's. He was not a James Bond figure. He was a grinder. He was the man you sent in when you needed to find a needle in a haystack by burning the haystack down piece by piece. Thorn's assignment was simple on paper but nightmare in practice: check into the Palazzo Vernazza, integrate himself into the ecosystem of the hotel, and identify the leak. He was given the cover identity of a mid-level logistics consultant for a shipping firm, a boring man with a boring job who enjoyed expensive scotch. On a rainy Tuesday in November, Thorn stepped out of a taxi in front of the hotel. The doorman, in a pristine uniform with gold braiding, held a large umbrella to shield him from the downpour. Thorn tipped him, walked through the revolving brass doors, and entered the lobby. The air smelled of beeswax, fresh lilies, and old money. It was quiet, the kind of heavy silence that absorbs secrets. Thorn approached the reception desk, smiling a tired smile, knowing that from this moment on, he was on stage. He didn't know who the enemy was, but he knew one thing for certain: they were already watching him. The psychology of a five-star hotel is unique. It is designed to make the guest feel like the center of the universe, yet the guest is actually the most vulnerable person in the building. A guest leaves their clothes, their documents, and their habits exposed to an army of invisible staff. The maids know what you drink. The concierge knows who you call. The waiters know who you dine with. Thorn spent his first 3 days doing absolutely nothing of intelligence value. This was standard tradecraft. If there was a pro working the hotel, they would be sniffing for ghosts, people who didn't fit their cover. A logistics consultant shouldn't be sweeping his room for bugs every hour or making dead drops in the park. He should be boring. So, Thorn was boring. He went to meetings with legitimate shipping contacts the station had arranged. He ate dinner alone in the hotel restaurant. He complained to the front desk about the water pressure. But while he played the part of the weary businessman, his eyes were recording everything. The Palazzo Vernazza was a machine. Thorne observed the rhythm of the shifts. The morning crew arrived at 6 a.m., sleepy-eyed and efficient. The evening crew took over at 3 p.m., sharper, more polished. He noted the hierarchy. The general manager was a terrified-looking man named Rossi, who seemed more concerned with the dust on the skirting boards than global politics. The head of housekeeping was a stern woman who ran her floor like a military boot camp. Thorne focused on the points of friction, the places where staff and guests interacted most intimately. The bar, the restaurant, and the concierge desk. The bar was run by a man named Enzo. Enzo was charismatic, loud, and poured generous drinks. Thorne sat at the bar for 3 nights straight, nursing bourbons and listening. Enzo loved to talk. He gossiped about the film stars staying on the 3rd floor and the politicians arguing in the private booths. Thorne ruled him out quickly. Enzo was too loose. A Soviet asset needed discipline. Enzo was a performer, not a spy. If he knew a secret, he'd sell it to a tabloid, not the KGB. Then there was the concierge, a young man named Marco. He was eager to please, constantly on the phone, arranging tickets for the opera or reservations at exclusive clubs. Thorne tested him. He asked Marco to mail a letter for him, a letter that was sealed but contained a deliberate lure, a reference to a fake shipping contract that would be valuable to a competitor. Thorne had tampered with the seal in a way that would show if it had been opened. The letter arrived at its destination pristine. Marco was likely clean, or at least he wasn't looking for industrial espionage. That left the restaurant. La Sala d'Oro, the Golden Room. It was the heart of the hotel. High ceilings, frescoes of Roman gods looking down on the diners, and tables spaced far enough apart to offer the illusion of privacy, but close enough for sound to carry if you knew how to listen. The restaurant was the domain of the maître d'hôtel, a man named Alessandro Ricci. Ricci was a study in elegance. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, immaculate in his tuxedo. He moved through the dining room like a dancer, never rushing, yet always appearing exactly when a glass needed refilling or a napkin had fallen. He spoke 5 languages fluently: Italian, English, French, German, and Russian. Thorne watched him from a corner table on his 4th night. Ricci was not servile. He commanded the room. When a senator from New York walked in, Ricci didn't just greet him, he managed him. He guided him to a table that faced the window, away from the kitchen noise. When a NATO general dined there the following night, Ricci recommended a Barolo that was not on the list. Thorne felt a prickle on the back of his neck. It was the instinct that had kept him alive in Berlin. Ricci was too good. He was too observant. He wasn't just managing the service, he was managing the information flow of the room. He decided where people sat. He decided which waiter served which table. He controlled the environment, and in the world of intelligence, control is everything. Confirming a suspicion in a hostile environment is a delicate operation. Thorne couldn't simply wiretap the maitre d'. The Italian laws on surveillance were strict, and the CIA was technically operating as a guest of the host government. If they were caught bugging a private citizen in a prominent hotel without a warrant from the Italian judiciary, the diplomatic fallout would be nuclear. The station chief made it clear: do not get caught. If you get burned, we don't know you. Thorne needed a technical team, but he couldn't bring in a van full of equipment parked out front. The years of lead meant the police were checking every strange vehicle for terrorists. A CIA surveillance van would stand out like a neon sign. Instead, Thorne requested a tech in a box. 2 days later, a couple checked into the hotel. They were registered as Mr. and Mrs. Miller, tourists from Ohio. In reality, they were distinct technical officers from the Technical Services Division, specialists in close target reconnaissance. Their luggage contained portable audio surveillance gear disguised as hair dryers and shaving kits. Thorne met Mr. Miller in the hotel sauna. Amid the steam and the heat where no microphones could survive, they formulated a plan. The restaurant is a nightmare acoustically, Miller whispered, wiping sweat from his eyes. Marble floors, high ceilings, clinking silverware. It's white noise hell. We can't get a directional mic in there that will pick up a whisper. I don't need to hear the diners, Thorne said. I need to hear Ricci. I need to know what he does when the service is over. They decided to target Ricci's office. It was a small, windowless room behind the kitchen where he managed the reservations and inventory. It was the only place he was alone. Getting a bug into that office required a diversion. The CIA orchestrated a minor crisis. They had an agent pose as a food supplier who delivered a crate of exclusive truffles to the kitchen. When the kitchen staff was distracted by the expensive delivery and the argument over the invoice, Mrs. Miller, claiming to be a lost guest looking for the restrooms, slipped into the back corridor. She had 10 seconds. She reached the door of Ricci's office. It was unlocked. She stepped in. The room was sparse. A desk, a chair, a calendar, and a telephone. She couldn't plant a sophisticated device inside the phone in that time. Instead, she stuck a limpet, a tiny battery-operated transmitter no larger than a coin, under the lip of the desk drawer. She was back in the hallway before the chef had finished shouting about the price of truffles. For the next week, Thorne and the Millers took turns monitoring the frequency from their rooms. Most of what they heard was mundane. Ricci arguing with suppliers about the quality of veal. Ricci scheduling shifts for the waiters. Ricci calling his wife to say he would be late. But then, on a Thursday night, the pattern broke. The restaurant had closed. The staff had gone home. The bug picked up the sound of the office door closing and the lock turning. Then, silence. Ricci didn't leave. He didn't call his wife. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. The Miller's equipment recorded the clicks of the rotary dial. Thorne analyzed the sequence. It wasn't a long-distance number. It was local. "The laundry is ready for pickup," Ricci said in Italian. His voice was flat, devoid of the charm he used in the dining room. A pause. 5 shirts. Starch the collars. Tomorrow at 10. He hung up. Thorne replayed the tape in his room, smoke curling from his cigarette. "The laundry is ready." It was a classic code. Innocent enough to pass as a wrong number or a legitimate errand, but specific enough to trigger a meeting. 5 shirts. Tomorrow at 10. Ricci wasn't just a maitre d', he was active, and he was about to make a move. Thorne knew that 5 shirts meant 5 pieces of intelligence, or perhaps a rating of importance. Tomorrow at 10 was the time, but where? A spy doesn't hand over classified NATO documents at the hotel laundry service. Thorne had to follow Ricci. Surveillance in Rome is an art form. The streets are narrow, crowded, and chaotic. A single follower stands out. You need a team. Thorne called in the Ghosts, a squad of Italian-speaking CIA officers who specialized in foot surveillance. They were masters of blending in. They looked like students, shopkeepers, and priests. The next morning, at 9:30 a.m., Ricci exited the Palazzo Vernazza through the staff entrance. He was not wearing his tuxedo. He wore a brown raincoat and a flat cap. He looked like any other Roman grandfather going for a morning walk. He walked towards the Piazza Barberini. Thorne was 2 blocks back, communicating with his team via a concealed radio. "Target is moving north," Thorne muttered into his lapel. "Copy. I have him at the newsstand," a female voice crackled. That was Sarah, an agent posing as a tourist reading a map. Ricci didn't look back. He didn't use anti-surveillance techniques like stopping abruptly to tie his shoe or changing direction. This worried Thorne. It meant Ricci was either an amateur, which seemed unlikely given his position, or he was so confident in his cover that he didn't think anyone would ever suspect him. Or he was a professional of the highest caliber who knew that acting paranoid was the surest way to get caught. Ricci entered a busy cafe near the Trevi Fountain. He ordered an espresso and stood at the bar. He didn't speak to anyone. He drank his coffee, left a coin on the counter, and walked out. "He's clean at the cafe," Sarah reported. "No contact." Ricci continued walking. He entered a small park. He sat on a bench. He fed the pigeons. He checked his watch. 10 a.m. A man in a blue suit walked past the bench. He was carrying a folded newspaper under his arm. He sat down on the other end of the bench. They didn't look at each other. They didn't speak. The man in the blue suit opened his paper. Ricci continued to feed the birds. After 3 minutes, the man in the blue suit stood up. He left his newspaper on the bench. Ricci waited another minute. Then he stood up. He didn't pick up the newspaper. He simply walked away, heading back toward the hotel. Thorne watched from behind a statue. He didn't make the pickup, he whispered. Why didn't he make the pickup? Then a third man appeared, a jogger in a tracksuit. He slowed down near the bench, tied his shoe, and scooped up the newspaper. The jogger took off running towards the metro station. Thorne realized the complexity of the operation. The man in the blue suit was a cutout, a middleman. The newspaper was the drop, but Ricci hadn't touched it. That meant Ricci wasn't receiving instructions. He had already passed something. Or perhaps the meeting was a signal. Thorne signaled his team. Do not follow the jogger. Stay on Ricci. They followed the maitre d' back to the hotel. He went through the staff entrance, changed into his tuxedo, and began his shift. To the world, he was just Alessandro, the charming host. But Thorne now knew the truth. The phone call about the laundry wasn't a meeting arrangement. It was a signal that the drop had been loaded somewhere else, or that the meeting in the park was merely a visual confirmation that the channel was open. Thorne returned to his room and poured a drink. He realized he had underestimated the sophistication of the network. This wasn't just one man selling secrets. This was a pipeline. And Ricci was the valve. In counterintelligence, when you identify a suspected leak but don't know exactly what they are stealing or how they are doing it, you use a technique called a barium meal. In medicine, you feed a patient radioactive barium to see where the blockage is in their digestive system. In espionage, you feed the suspect marked information to see where it ends up. Thorne needed to prove that Ricci was the one listening. He needed to catch him red-handed. The plan was risky. It required exposing actual classified information, or at least information that looked real enough to fool a seasoned spy. Thorne coordinated with the U.S. naval attaché at the embassy. They created a document. It was a set of minutes from a fictional meeting regarding the deployment of nuclear-capable artillery shells to a base in northern Italy. It was labeled Top Secret, No Foreign nationals. The document was designated Blue Trident. Thorne needed a carrier. He couldn't use himself. His cover was too low level. He needed a target that Ricci couldn't resist. They flew in a specialist from London. His name was Captain Harris. He was a legitimate U.S. naval officer, but he had been briefed on the operation. His persona was that of a loose-lipped, arrogant aide to an admiral, in town for a hedonistic weekend before a major inspection. Harris checked into the Palazzo Vernazza. He was loud, he was demanding. He treated the staff with disdain, exactly the kind of American behavior that would make an Italian communist sympathize with the Soviets. Thorne watched from the bar as Harris made a show of his importance. Harris demanded the best table in the restaurant. Ricci, ever the professional, obliged. He seated Harris in the center of the room, under the grand chandelier. Harris ordered the most expensive champagne. He had a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. During dinner, he unlocked the briefcase, took out a red folder, and began reading it while eating his risotto. It was a gross violation of security protocol, the kind of thing that would get an officer court-martialed, but it was the bait. Ricci hovered. He poured the champagne. He recommended the dessert. Thorne observed Ricci's eyes. They didn't dart. They didn't stare. They just swept over the table, absorbing. At the end of the meal, Harris made his move. He stood up, slightly swaying as if drunk. He left the red folder on the table while he went to the restroom. This was the trap. Would Ricci take it? Would he photograph it? The dining room was busy. Ricci moved to the table to clear the plates. He placed a napkin over the red folder, concealing it. He picked up the stack of plates and the folder underneath, moving seamlessly toward the waiter's station. Thorne held his breath. If Ricci took the folder to the office, they had him. But Ricci didn't go to the office. He went to the service stand, a small podium in the corner of the room. He put the plates down. He lifted the napkin. He opened the folder. He didn't have a camera. He didn't have time to read it all. He pulled a pen from his pocket. He wasn't writing. He was marking. He made a tiny mark on the wine list that sat on the podium. Then he closed the folder, picked it up, and walked briskly toward the restrooms. He met Captain Harris coming out. "Sir," Ricci said, his voice dripping with concern, "you left this at your table. I thought it best to secure it immediately." He handed the folder back. Harris looked stunned. He took the folder. "Oh, yes, thank you, Alessandro. Good man." Thorne watched the exchange. Ricci had returned the bait. He hadn't stolen it. He hadn't photographed it. He had been the perfect employee. Thorne felt a pit in his stomach. Had he been wrong? Was Ricci just a loyal maitre d' protecting a careless guest? But then, Thorne remembered the service stand, the wine list. Later that night, after the restaurant closed, Thorne broke into the dining room. He went to the service podium. He found the wine list Ricci had touched. He flipped through it. There, on page 4, next to a vintage Chianti, was a tiny dot made in blue ink. It looked like a printing error, but under a magnifying glass, it was a specific symbol, a triangle with a line through it. Thorne realized the truth. Ricci didn't need to photograph the documents. He didn't need to steal them. He was a spotter and an assessor. He was marking the target. The dot told the KGB, "This man has access. He is careless. He is vulnerable." Ricci wasn't the thief. He was the one who opened the door for the thieves. But the blue trident information, Ricci had seen the title. He knew the topic. The barium meal was in the system. Now they had to see where the sickness appeared. 3 days later, the station in Rome picked up a signal. The Soviet embassy on Via Gaeta transmitted a burst of encrypted data to Moscow. The NSA intercept station in San Vito captured it. Decoding Soviet ciphers in 1974 was a slow, grinding process. But the traffic analysis showed a spike in urgency. The message was sent using a one-time pad priority. Thorne met with the station chief in a safe house near the Colosseum. "We can't read the message yet," the chief said, pouring stale coffee. "But the timing tracks. Harris flashes the folder on Tuesday. Thursday, the Soviets are screaming at Moscow. They took the bait." Ricci passed the info, Thorne said. "But how? He didn't meet anyone. He didn't use the phone." "He must have a dead drop inside the hotel," the chief said. "Somewhere he can leave a message without leaving the building." Thorne went back to the hotel. He had to find the internal drop. He began to analyze Ricci's movements again. The morning routine, the evening service, the interactions with staff. He noticed something about the menus. Every night, the old menus were collected and stacked in the service area. Every morning, fresh menus were placed on the tables. Thorne intercepted the trash. He paid a porter 50,000 lira to let him sort through the restaurant's waste paper before it went to the incinerator. It was a filthy job. Thorne spent hours in the basement, sifting through coffee grounds and old napkins. He found it on a paper placemat used for the room service trays. It looked like a doodle, a series of numbers scrawled on the corner, as if a waiter had been calculating a tip. 14, 55, 02. Thorne copied them down. He compared them to the blue trident document. Page 14, paragraph 55, line 02. It was a reference. Ricci wasn't writing out the intelligence. He was using a code based on a book or a document that both he and his handler possessed. But wait, Ricci had only seen the folder for 10 seconds. He couldn't have memorized page numbers. Thorne realized he was looking at it wrong. The numbers weren't about the document. They were coordinates. Or a time. 14:55, 2:55 p.m., 02. Maybe a location? Room 02, floor 2. Thorne looked at the hotel roster. Who was staying in room 202? He checked the registration. Room 202 was occupied by a Mr. Ivanova, a trade delegate from Bulgaria, a satellite state of the Soviet Union. It was so simple it was brilliant. The handler wasn't meeting Ricci in a park. The handler was a guest in the hotel. Ricci was sending messages via room service. Thorne had his target, Mr. Ivanova, room 202. The Bulgarian was a heavy-set man who rarely left his room. He ordered breakfast, lunch, and dinner on a tray. Thorne realized the mechanism. Ricci would write the intelligence, or the signal that a target was ripe, on the placemat, or tuck a note inside the folded napkin of the room service tray, designated for room 202. The waiter would deliver it, unknowingly carrying the secrets. Ivanova would eat his meal, retrieve the note, and perhaps send a reply back on the dirty tray. It was a perfect closed loop. No meetings, no radio signals. Just a waiter carrying a tray of pasta. Thorne needed to intercept a message. He couldn't compromise the waiter. He had to be the waiter. Thorne spoke Italian, but his accent was American. He couldn't pass as a local Roman waiter. He needed a diversion. He staged a plumbing emergency on the second floor. The hotel shut off the water to that wing. The guests were furious. Management was in chaos. Thorne, wearing a maintenance uniform he had stolen from the laundry cart, roamed the hallway. He watched the room service waiter approach room 202. The waiter knocked. Ivanova opened the door, looking annoyed, wearing a bathrobe. "Compliments of the manager, sir," the waiter said, handing over a bottle of wine and a tray of fruit to apologize for the water issue. Thorne saw Ricci at the end of the hall. Ricci was supervising. He wasn't just watching. He was ensuring the delivery happened. As the waiter turned to leave, Ricci nodded at him. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture. Thorne waited until the hallway was empty. He moved to the service elevator where the dirty trays were brought down. He knew Ivanova would finish the wine and put the tray out eventually. He waited for 4 hours in a linen closet. Finally, at 11 p.m., the door to 202 opened. Ivanova placed the tray on the floor. Thorne moved. He walked softly down the carpeted hall. He crouched by the tray. The wine bottle was empty. The fruit was gone. The napkin was crumpled. Thorne carefully uncrumpled the napkin. Nothing. He checked under the plate. Nothing. He checked the wine cork. He pulled the cork out of the empty bottle. It felt light. Too light. He squeezed it. It was hollowed out. Inside, there was a tiny strip of microfilm. Thorne pocketed the cork, replaced it with a regular one he had brought in his pocket, and vanished back into the shadows. The link was confirmed. Ricci was passing microfilm to the Bulgarian via room service wine bottles. The blue trident data, or whatever else Ricci had gathered, was on that film. Thorne took the microfilm to the station. The lab technicians developed it. The images were damning. They weren't just about the blue trident bait. They were photographs of passenger manifests, summaries of conversations overheard in the bar, notes on the sexual proclivities of Italian politicians, and, most critically, a detailed schematic of the U.S. Embassy's security checkpoints, information Ricci could only have gotten from observing the security detail of a visiting ambassador. Ricci was a one-man intelligence agency. "We have enough to arrest him," the station chief said. "We hand him to the Italian Carabinieri. They lock him up. Game over." "No," Thorne said. "If we arrest him, Ivanova walks. Diplomatic immunity. He goes back to Sofia and gets a medal. We need to burn the whole network." Thorne wanted to turn Ricci. He wanted to make the maitre d' work for them. "He's an ideologue," the chief argued. "He's been doing this for years. He won't flip." "Everyone flips," Thorne said. "You just have to find the leverage." Thorne dug into Ricci's life. He bypassed the hotel and looked at the man. Alessandro Ricci, born 1918, partisan fighter during the war, a communist from the old days, fighting Mussolini. That explained the loyalty to the cause. He didn't do it for money. He did it because he believed in the revolution. But revolutionaries grow old. They have families. Ricci had a daughter, Sofia. She was 22. She was a student at the University of Rome, and she was in trouble. Thorne found police reports that had been buried. Sofia had been arrested twice for possession of marijuana. Both times the charges had disappeared. Why? Because Ricci had called in favors? No. A maitre d' doesn't have that much pull. The KGB had made the charges disappear. That was the hook. They were protecting his daughter. But that protection was also a threat. "We keep her out of jail. You keep stealing secrets." Thorne saw the angle. He didn't need to threaten Ricci with prison. He needed to show Ricci that the Soviets didn't care about his daughter. They were using her as collateral. Thorne chose the location carefully. Not an interrogation room, not a police station. He chose table 4, the corner table in La Sala d'Oro. It was 3 p.m. The restaurant was closed between lunch and dinner. The room was empty, bathed in the golden afternoon light of Rome. Thorne sat at the table. He placed a file on the white tablecloth. Ricci entered from the kitchen, checking the settings. He saw Thorne. He stopped. He recognized him as the boring logistics consultant. But something in Thorne's posture had changed. The slump was gone. The eyes were hard. "I'm afraid we are closed, sir," Ricci said, his voice polite but firm. "The kitchen is closed, Alessandro," Thorne said in perfect Italian. But we need to talk about the wine, specifically the corks. Ricci went still. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He stood with the dignity of a captain going down with his ship. "I don't know what you mean," Ricci said. Thorne opened the file. He laid out the photos. The meeting in the park, the room service tray, the microfilm. Ricci looked at them. He sighed, a long, weary exhalation. He pulled out a chair and sat down. It was the first time he had ever sat with a guest. "Who are you?" Ricci asked. "I'm the man who can save your daughter," Thorne said. He laid out the second set of photos. "Sophia. The KGB isn't protecting her, Alessandro. They are documenting her. Look at this." Thorne showed him a transcript. It was a conversation between Ivanova and his handler. They were discussing Sophia. They weren't talking about helping her. They were talking about how easy she would be to blackmail if Ricci ever wanted to retire. They called her the insurance policy. Ricci read the Russian transcript. His hands began to shake. "They own you," Thorne said softly. "And when you are too old to serve the wine, they will use her to keep the information flowing. Is that the revolution you fought for? Pimping out your daughter to a Bulgarian bureaucrat?" Ricci looked up. There were tears in his eyes. The arrogance was gone. "What do you want?" "I want Ivanova," Thorne said. "And I want the man behind him, the resident. Turning a spy is dangerous. The moment they agree, they are living on borrowed time. If they flinch, if they sweat too much, the handler knows." Ricci was a professional actor. He had spent 30 years pretending to care about the problems of rich people. He could pretend to be loyal to the Soviets for a few more days. Thorne gave him a script. Ricci was to tell Ivanova that he had something big. The Blue Trident was just the beginning. He claimed to have overheard a NATO general discussing the location of the tactical nukes. He requested a face-to-face meeting with the resident. He said the information was too complex for a cork. He needed to explain the maps. Ivanova balked. "It's too dangerous." "Then I burn the maps," Ricci threatened. "And I tell Moscow you were too cowardly to collect the prize." It worked. Greed and ambition are powerful motivators in the KGB. Ivanova agreed to set up the meet. It was set for Sunday night. The catacombs of San Callisto, a tourist trap by day, a labyrinth of shadows by night. Thorne and his team prepped the site. They couldn't bug the whole catacomb. They had to rely on visual confirmation. Ricci went in wired, a microphone taped to his chest, hidden under his tuxedo shirt. Thorne waited in a van outside the Appian Way entrance. The tension was electric. If Ricci betrayed them, Thorne would have to storm the catacombs. "Target is entering," the radio crackled. Ricci walked into the dark tunnels. He carried a flashlight. Deep inside, in a small burial chamber, a figure waited. It wasn't Ivanova. It was a man Thorne had been hunting for 3 years, Victor Kogan, the KGB chief of station in Rome, the head of the snake. "You have the maps?" Kogan asked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I have them," Ricci said. His voice was steady. "But first, we talk about Sophia." "We do not negotiate with assets," Kogan snapped. "You do today," Ricci said. Thorne signaled the team. "Move in. Go. Go. Go." The raid was surgical. Flashbangs detonated, blinding the darkness with magnesium white light. Polizia, fermi tutti. Technically, it was the Italian Special Forces, the NOx, executing the arrest, with the CIA observing. Thorne couldn't carry a gun during the arrest, but he was the first one into the chamber. Kogan reached for a pistol. A laser sight landed on his chest. He froze. He knew the rules. Dead spies are useless. Captured spies are currency. He raised his hands. Ricci stood there, blinded by the light, holding the fake maps. As the police handcuffed Kogan and dragged him out, cursing in Russian, Thorne walked up to Ricci. "Is it over?" Ricci asked. "For Kogan, yes," Thorne said. "For you, it's complicated." Ricci was arrested. It had to look real. If he was just released, the Soviets would know he had turned. He had to go to prison. "We'll get you out in 2 years," Thorne promised, quietly. "And Sophia, we've already moved her. She's in a safe house in Tuscany. She's clean, no record." Ricci nodded. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket even in the damp catacomb. He looked at Thorne with a strange expression. Respect? Or perhaps just the shared weariness of the game. The service at the hotel will suffer, Ricci said dryly. The new maitre d'. He confuses the fish forks with the salad forks. I'm sure they'll manage, Thorne said. The arrest of Victor Kogan was a massive blow to Soviet operations in Italy. The Rome network collapsed. Dozens of sleeper agents were identified and expelled. The leak at the Palazzo Vernazza was plugged. Thorne stayed in Rome for another month to wrap up the paperwork. He checked out of the hotel. He went back to his real office at the embassy. A year later, Thorne returned to the Palazzo Vernazza for a drink. He sat at the bar. The hotel was the same. The chandeliers sparkled. The diplomats whispered. He looked into the dining room. It was bustling. Waiters in white jackets moved like swans. But the rhythm was off. The elegance was slightly frayed. A guest at table 4 was waving his hand, trying to get attention. A wine glass sat empty for too long. The new maitre d' was a young man, sweating slightly, overwhelmed by the demands of the room. Thorne finished his bourbon. He thought about Ricci, sitting in a cell in a military prison, serving his time for a cause that was already dying. He thought about the invisible war that never really ended, only changed players. He left a generous tip. As he walked out into the cool Roman night, he looked back at the revolving doors. The hotel was a beautiful stage, but the best actor was gone. The Cold War ground on, but in the Palazzo Vernazza, the show had lost its director. If you enjoyed this story, remember to subscribe for more unclassified history. Next time, we travel to Berlin to uncover the tunnel that tapped the Kremlin's phone lines.